Hi everyone, and welcome to part 3 of How to Write a Book, Character Design. For those of you who watched part 1, the overview, and are saying, there was no character design slide, this is all part of building the skeleton and outlining your book. We're taking notes, we're doing the groundwork, so that when you actually sit down to write a chapter, there is nothing standing in your way. Now, there are about 1 million different methods to make characters, and ultimately you will have to find one that works for you. Some people suggest filling hundreds of pages of questionnaires and personality quizzes for each character, while others suggest doing absolutely nothing. My advice falls somewhere in the middle. I will also say that the degree to which you have to know your character depends critically on 3 things. Firstly, how long is your book? Because a short story is going to require far less character depth than a 1,000,000-word fantasy epic. The genre is also important. If your books are more action-focused and less character development, then you will need less character depth than if you're writing, say, a heartfelt family noir. And thirdly, the role of that particular character. Obviously, your main character will need to have more depth than the bartender that they talk to once on page 3 and is never mentioned again. So use your judgment to determine which characters fall into which category and where your book falls on the above spectrum. A word of caution though, my books are very much what I call popcorn fiction. That is, they're action-heavy, pew-pew adventure with not so much focus on feelings and relationships. But that doesn't mean that I can get away with shallow characters. Trust me. You might think that the books you read don't have any character depth, but they do, at least some. If they didn't, you probably wouldn't enjoy it even if you didn't realize why. This episode is going to focus on my method of designing key characters. These are the ones that get a lot of screen time. The characters that have less important roles get less details than this. And if I ever decide to write something that was more character than action focused, I would probably have to delve a bit more into their internal desires. So, take this advice and use it in a way that suits the story that you are telling. Here is the template that I use to build characters. You can download a copy from the link in the description in both Word and PDF formats. First things first, you need to name your character. All I'll say on this is that try to pick a name that's easy for readers to read. So you don't want them stumbling over this name every time they see it written down on a page. Avoid weird apostrophes or 4 consonants in a row or something that's going to make it hard for the reader every time they see it. And also pick a name that fits into the setting of your story. So a sci-fi name is probably going to be different to a name that's set in a medieval community, for example. And similarly, probably orc names are going to be different to human names. Alright, the second thing is occupation. In most people's lives, their job is what takes up most of the time of their life. So even if you're writing a horror or a fantasy or a sci-fi, your character probably has a day job, even if that day job is monster hunting, for example. So make a note of it, because their job will affect their friends, their habits, and their world experience. It also means that they have a position outside of the specific story that you're telling, and that's important for character depth. The third thing is a physical description. Now, this is probably what beginners focus on, and they probably put too much emphasis on this. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to be like they have 3 freckles on their right shoulder and a slightly larger middle toe. Just pick key aspects that will make this character memorable. Think of characters that have really stuck with you in the books that you've read. The authors didn't necessarily describe every little wrinkle. They just gave you key information so that you could build an image for yourself. Think of hobbits and their furry feet, or Harry Potter and his scar. So really think about what descriptor you want to be the base of your character. Are they really tall or bald, or do they have 2 heads? You can include other things in this description like hair and eye color, but I wouldn't make that the focus if I were you, unless there's a particular aspect of that that really speaks to your character. You can include vague clothing notes here too that might help you when you're describing your character. Now, more important than physical description is the personality of your character. Are they a nice, generous person, or do they enjoy violence? Are they shallow, religious, brooding? What in their lives do they care about? Another good way to make your character stick in a reader's mind is to give them habits or mannerisms. Now, please don't go overboard here. You don't want your character to have a dozen nervous tics that make up the whole book. But it can be good to give them something that makes them memorable or stand out. For example, if your character is a vigilante who experienced violence when they were young, they might carry a knife with them always, even to the shower. Or perhaps they're always cold and so wear a jacket and stay close to fires. Or maybe they really like food. That's hobbits again. Make your character stand out from the faceless masses, but in a way that makes sense. Which links to the next aspect, background. Background is key to any fully fledged story. This doesn't mean that you have to write a journal of the character's life from when they were born, but you do need to know the key events that explains their character. So what you noted down in the personality section has to make sense based on their background. This is also where you make sure that your character is the right one for the story. Why are they the ones that these events happen to? Or why are they the ones that act on the events? A word of warning though, be aware of stereotypes. The Scrooge-like character who is very rich but doesn't spare a penny for his workers just because he's selfish is a bit overdone. Never mind that it might represent real people, but you want your characters to have more depth than that. Give them a solid background that readers will understand. Maybe that Scrooge character was bullied by those same workers as a child. Or perhaps the Scrooge character doesn't want to appear weak because of hard lessons laid into him by his parents. The background should also leave an aspect of the characters' lives that needs improvement. In my example here, the character's sister was kidnapped when they were both young, and my character has felt guilty about it ever since. This leads to them being standoffish and distrusting, but it also leaves an open story arc of finding her sister. This background section can be as long or short as you want, as long as it has enough meat in it to support your character and their story. These next two are my favorite sections because this is really where you can build depth into your characters, and it also provides conflict for your story. Firstly, internal conflicts. These come from your character's background and personality. Really try to dive deep and come up with at least 3 things here. For example, an internal conflict might be as simple as your character really wants to lose weight, but they love cake. So their internal conflict is to eat or not to eat. Having said that, you probably want to include a couple with a bit more depth than that. So, for example, do they keep working at a well-paying job even though they hate it? Or in my example, the character is tormented by guilt about their sister and so never takes time off because she doesn't deserve it. And this creates that internal conflict of gotta keep working, but there's other things competing for time, and how do I deal with this guilt? So have a think about how these internal conflicts will influence the way your character behaves and the choices that they make. The other side of that same coin is external conflict. This is how you create subplots and sub-conflicts that go beyond the basic plot of your story. Everyone has conflicts in their lives, and usually multiple. It might be with colleagues, a bad boss, an ex-romantic partner, a noisy neighbor, a political adversary, a business rival. The list goes on and on. Just don't go too overboard with this. A character who had all of those conflicts at once won't have time for your actual story. But do try to come up with at least 3 external conflicts that are separate to your main plot, but they can give depth to it. So in my example, the character is captain of a transporter, and their cargo isn't always above board, so they have conflict with port authorities. They also have no respect for the law enforcement because they didn't save her sister, which creates conflict. And they don't like anyone who comes onto their ship and doesn't do what they say or doesn't follow orders. All 3 of these things are going to cause conflict in the story that is separate to the main arc. Now, all of this background and conflict that we've discussed leads to what your character wants. They have to want something beyond the main plot that you're throwing at them. It doesn't have to be anything grand or world-changing, but it should be important to the character. For example, Harry Potter wanted to belong. He didn't want to kill a dark magician, at least not to begin with. And Bilbo just wanted to enjoy a nice, quiet life with a good meal. He didn't want to steal from a dragon. The last thing you have to know about your character is their flaw, and they must have at least one. Your character can't be perfect. Perfect characters are boring, not to mention unrealistic. Even characters that don't change over a story, think Sherlock Holmes, are still flawed. He was downright rude and insensitive a lot of the time. Your character should have a flaw that makes them relatable. Just make sure it doesn't make readers hate them. Perhaps your character is too quick to judge, or they have a short temper, or maybe they're too trusting and it gets them into trouble. And there we go. By answering these few questions, you now have a fully fleshed character that you can be confident will give depth to your story. And it didn't require writing 50 pages of backstory about their favorite type of ice cream. Make sure you like and subscribe so that you can join me on the next episode where we will take your character and write a story for them. Thank you.